When we started the diversity and inclusion task force, we had a goal that, guided by our 4-way test, to come up with implementation of actionable strategies aimed at raising the awareness of white privilege, promoting recognition and appreciation of differences among our club members as well as community members, creating positive impact in the community for peoples of color, of various socioeconomic status and life experience, various religious beliefs, sexual orientation, preferences, and abilities. So as we lean into this, one thing we need to do is we need to learn what life is like for others. Given 15 or 20 minutes of a discussion, it's not an adequate time to know everything we need to know, but at least we can start somewhere. So Lopa has kindly agreed to come speak with us. And she had told me that in spite of her many, many presentations to many people across the globe, she's never spoken to a Rotary Club. So we're the first. Lopa teaches economics and on the environment at Bennington College. She studies natural disasters and the unevenness of economic distributions. I do encourage us all to go to bennington.edu, and you can learn more about Lopa's extensive biography. So I will hand it over to Lopa and mute myself. Thank you again.
This is a very, very welcome opportunity, Mary, really, honestly. And I am truly, truly very grateful for this chance to speak to the community. You see, I have been here in the college for about 5 years now, but it seems that there is a separation between the town and the gown. I have never really been part of the town. My life starts and ends within the campus boundary. So this is a wonderful opportunity for me to speak. And this forum, I'd be curious to know about the reactions. But I must apologize in advance. I may come up as rather pedantic, and this presentation would be rather dry, because that is the kind of person that I am. Please bear with me. So I hope we can have a more interactive session during question and answer. And please do feel free to stop me, even within the presentation, if you have some questions. Now, I have one request. I wish to present you with some figures and data. Would it be possible for you to make me a co-host so that I can share my screen with you? So this is what I wish to talk to you about. And this is who I am. Lopamudra Banerjee, that's my name. And do feel free to call me Lopa. What I will talk to you about is a general structure of diversity and inclusion and what it has to do. It is more from the, shall I say, bird's eye view of how it is seen from the perspective of an economist. So consider me an outsider looking into the way I see into the map and bringing you the evidences that are there in the literature and evidences that have been gathered by, shall I say, reputable organizations. So all the data that I'm going to show you are publicly available. Most of them are from Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is something that you can get right away by accessing the right website. And should you be interested, I will, of course, share with you the sources. I've also made use of two other places, Pew Research Center and McKinsey Company. So whatever I show you, these things are publicly available. My task over here is to tell you a larger story as how economists see the issue. The presentation is going to be organized in these parts. There are actually going to be 5 specific parts. First, I shall offer for you certain definition. Now, Mary has already offered the definition of diversity and inclusiveness in some way. I shall broaden upon those things. Once I present you with the definitions, I will present you with certain evidences to show what is the nature of the problem that we are going to study. And then I'm going to offer you certain explanations that have been offered by economists. So why does the problem exist? then why should we bother? That should be the implication part of the thing, and the resolution, what should be done. So the classic 5-part way in which we do analytical studies in economy: we present we define the terms, we present evidences, we explain why, we then talk about why is it bad and why should we care. That is the implications part of it, and what should need to be done. The classic way of doing things. So allow me to start by first defining the concepts: diversity, inclusion, and a third term, equity. Diversity and inclusion are words that are used more in the common parlance. In economics, however, we are far more interested in the question of equity, and I shall tell you why that is so and what's the difference. In everyday language, as Mary has suggested, that diversity represents a full spectrum of human demographic differences. And we shall be talking about racial difference, for example. And inclusion refers to culture and environmental sense of belonging. All right. So while diversity is about demographic differences, inclusion is about the different people are still nevertheless have this sense of belonging to any institution that we are talking about. So the important thing is, what is the relationship between this diversity and inclusion? Inclusion has to be understood as a very different concept, as a distinct concept from diversity, because just by having a visual optic effect of many different people of colors and plumes, that will not do the job for us. Each member should think individually their values are welcomed, that the institution must also think that these differences add certain new and unique perspective. And also, these individuals should be able to fully participate in the organization. When I'm talking about fully participating in an organization, I'm talking about right from the custodian till the top executive. They should be able to bring in this new viewpoint. Why? Because the kind of tasks, the kind of things that we contribute to any business are quite different depending upon what kind of work that we are doing. Obviously, a CEO's work is a CEO's work, but then again, a CEO does not have the skill level to do the work of a custodian. That person is no less valued. This is the premise with which we start in economic analysis. So the economist perspective, however, is a little different. So while I have defined you diversity and inclusion in everyday language, everyday parlance, in economics, we are, however, far more interested in the quality of being fair and impartial. This may be true for an individual institution, this may be true for an individual, but by and large, we are far more interested to talk about what is happening at the level of the structure, what is happening at the aggregate macroeconomic level, what is the trend that we are observing, how is the quality of life for people changing over long run, what are their material conditions of living, what are their chances in life. These are the broader questions that I'm going to talk about. So my presentation is going to be quite different from a psychologist viewpoint or an anthropologist viewpoint, which takes a more, a cultural, experiential understanding of equity and diversity. For me, it is only going to be dry facts and figure, but I'll try my best to relate that to the specificities of experiences of people. When we talk about equity, we are basically talking about each one of us getting what we need to survive or succeed. So I'm talking about each one of us getting what we need. Now, what do we need? That can be as vague as something called opportunity. It can be networks. It can be resources in terms of financial and non-financial resources. It can be all kinds of supports. So whatever it is, we are getting what we need to survive or succeed. So the problem becomes the concern, the say, $32 million question is that all of us do not have similar access to the things that we need to survive or succeed. The question is, why is it that we do not have similar access? And even before that, is it really true that we do not have similar access? So I should start with the evidences to show you how really is it the fact that we do not all have equal access. And I shall talk about access to education, access to income and wealth, which is often understood as an outcome of education. I'm going to talk about unequal conditions of employment, together with education and employment eventually determine income and wealth, but also in terms of, suppose we are not talking about education, income, wealth, or employment, but something that happens all of a sudden, which affect all of us at the same time in the quite random, idiosyncratic manner. For example, the COVID situation. I'm trying to argue that, I will try to show you that it is also true that there will be unequal impact of something that is coming entirely from outside. Now here I present you the example of COVID. I work on natural disasters. So for me, natural disaster is another kind of an exogenous shock, which is not supposed to choose its own victim, but it just so happened that some people always already suffer more than others. And the explanation for that, the one that we shall discuss, pertinent to our discussion today, is race. So this is going to be the thing. So I shall then present certain evidences for your consideration. So when we talk about unequalness, we are basically talking about some measure of gaps, some measure of difference. So basically think in terms of this. We are starting our race from a point and the race ends. Somebody reaches the, shall I say, the final line quicker than others. And when one person, the winner, has reached the line, there are these lagging people who are trying very hard to make up and reach that final point. And we wish to measure what is the time difference that will take for this group of people to reach that thing. So this is the notion of gap that we are talking about. It can also be a matter of whether or not, even if you're given sufficient time, can you make up for that gap? Because, well, you may not have the health or the stamina to go and make the gap even if we give you a very long period of time. So metaphorically, we are going to talk about how and why this gap exists and how that can be measured and whether or not that gap really exists. So I'm going to talk about racial gaps in education, in income, in wealth. I'm going to talk about the gaps that we observe in occupation and unemployment, and what are the impacts of exogenous shock, the differences, the gaps in impact of exogenous shocks, such as COVID shocks. So allow me to then show you certain evidences. I shall start with racial gaps in educational attainments. Take a look at this. So allow me to start by black and white achievement gap that has persisted. And this is the data that I'm getting from National Center for Education Statistics. We are comparing the two dates, 1965 and 2013, based upon scores earned in math tests and reading scores between 1965 and 2013. Now you should ask me, why am I using 2013? For no other reason except this is a very well cited study. And I wanted to provide you with the evidence that is known and established for very many different people. So the chances are the situation might have actually worsened as we have moved on. So we find that by and large, this in terms of math scores and reading scores, black and white achievement gaps for the 12th graders remain unacceptably large, which has been not that different from what it was in 1965. And progress is closing the gap outside of the South, but the situation, the gaps between southern parts of United States, really worrisome. This is the first piece of evidence that I'm going to offer to you. Why does this difference exist? There are 4 factors which consistently influence student achievement. Suppose we are all coming from similar economic background, similar location, similar age group, similar family background, similar parental background, but we are of different color. Then we have found that folks are, no, forget about equal colorism. No, you have to keep the difference in color. So basically, it has been well established in the literature that if students are educated in smaller schools, have smaller class sizes, have challenging curriculum, and more qualified teachers, then they do well. There is a clear distinction between these factors when we are talking about students of color and white students, non-color, white and non-white student, especially between Black and white students. It's a given. The predominantly minority schools, which most students of color attend, basically have larger size, class sizes are larger, curriculum offerings and materials are lower in quality, and teachers are much less qualified. Integrated schools, and this is a very well cited research that has been cited by Jeannie Oakes and Gary Oldfield's research, that minority students are segregated in lower track classes with larger class sizes, less qualified teachers, and lower quality curriculum. Now, when I start talking about diversity and inequality and inequity and inclusiveness, why is it that I'm starting from school-age children? Why is that? Because this is going to have a very different implication of life chances of people right from the very beginning. We find this is a research that is coming out of Labor Statistics, Bureau of Labor Statistics, 2015, annual averages. Why did I choose 2015? Because this was closest to the 2013 number that I had. So I wanted to tell you what is happening in terms of how many people are achieving different kind of a degree. Bachelor's degree and higher, the Asians have far greater than white, but consistently Blacks and African and Hispanic or Latino have less than white. Also, when we are talking about less than a high school diploma, Hispanics are doing even worse than Black. Now, this degree basically is associated with a greater likelihood of employment and lower likelihood of unemployment. Nonetheless, at nearly every level of education, Blacks and Hispanics are more likely to be unemployed rather than whites and Asians. This is something that we know very well. Then, let us see what implication has that to do with when people actually graduate out of school and start participating in labor market by finding job, getting their occupation, earning income, and over their lifetime, gathering and accumulating wealth. Take a look at this. We find that 40%, that when we talk about, this is also from Bureau of Labor Statistics, this is the 2015 data set, that 51% of Asians have worked in management compared to 40% of whites compared to 30% of Blacks and 22% of the Hispanics. Now, when we are talking about management profession and related occupations, these are the higher tier of employment with better parks, with better income level, with better working condition, with better chances of sending their own children to a different kind of a school, moving into a different kind of neighborhood, and so forth. Consistently, we see that there is a racial difference between this happening. Once again, 2015 data. What implication does that have for unemployment rate? Look, consistently from 1979 to 2015, we have found that there is always a higher rate of Black male unemployment than white male. And in each period of economic shock, each period, this is the 1991, the dot-com bubble, this is the 2000 period of the economic shock of what happened during the, the World Trade Center situation. This is 2008 and 9. All the time we find that in each period of shock, this level of unemployment is shooting up, and it is shooting up more for people of Black racial identity than white. This is always happening. Average hourly earnings for men consistently have been higher than other groups, consistently higher. Now, when we are talking about income, this is averaged over all states in United States and in all kinds of occupations. So this is basically a median representative number that we are going to get. This is the most latest release from Bureau of Labor Statistics. Weekly earnings, fourth quarter of 2020. This is the latest data. And this is what the Labor Statistics Bureau tell us. Among the major race and ethnic groups, median weekly earnings of Blacks, this, Hispanic, this, consistently lower than white and Asian. And this is a pattern that we are already seeing over time, repeatedly, consistently. Take a look at this. So that was all about income and occupation, etc. Now we are talking about wealth. Consistently, we have found that in period, white folks have higher wealth than Black or Hispanic folks. And when we are defining wealth or net worth as total assets minus total liabilities, assets are resources with economic value, houses, retirement funds, saving accounts, etc. Liabilities or debts, we are talking about mortgage, student loans, car loans, and such things. So let us see what is happening in the home ownership data set. Consistently, we have found that this is from 1904 to 2015-16, the period that I'm talking about, that the chances of owning a home is far greater if you are a person if you are white. And if you are a racial minority, the chances have been consistently low, and the gap has actually been increasing. Once again, a figure from University Minnesota, their very important research on racial gap. So that is about the systemic conditions. What implications do racial gap have for people's material conditions of living, starting from education to their occupation, employment, unemployment chances, the kind of wage that they can earn, and the wealth that can generate, and their home ownership. Basically touching upon all elements of economic life that a person can live throughout their life spectrum, starting going to school and then owning a home and starting a family, etc., the entire lifetime spectrum that we are talking about. But not only are we talking about that systemic difference, we are also talking about differences in exogenous shock. And this is something that you probably are deeply familiar with, that during COVID, at least in July 30, 2022, we have found that a vast majority of people who have been affected are either Black or African American. And income loss, it has a clear pattern of racial differences depending upon which income group that you belong to. For example, if you are in this particular category, income losses have been more severe for white. But however, if you're in this category, these are mostly students, 15K or lower, the implications have been greater for white people. But when you earn a very high level of income, this would be the people who would be in the managerial professions, then there is no distinction between the effect experienced by people of color vis-a-vis people of non-people of color. So if you can reach at this point, it is only then COVID is not making any difference in terms of your racial identity. But to reach there, you need to have that occupation. And as we know that there are only very few people in this group that are people of color. And to be in that occupation, you need to have that education. As we know, very few people of color are getting that opportunity. So these gaps are really making differences. This is what is happening at the level of economy that we understand very well. But the question is, why should we? How should we explain this phenomena? Why does this exist? Now, I'm offering you explanations that have been explored and rejected and new explanation brought in this economic literature. I'm starting from 1965, going to 2020. I'm citing two Nobel laureates and one who I'm sure is going to get, which is very well known. In another 5 years or so, this person is going to be a Nobel laureate. We know very well. So George Stigler, he's arguing that, well, if there is a difference in income or wealth or employment or occupational status that we are observing across races, this is because some people work harder than others. And some people, therefore, are not getting paid enough because they have not contributed enough to the economic production. So they are not rewarded enough. Gary Becker had refuted this in 1971. So 65, Stigler says this is the reason. 71, Gary Becker comes and says that no, the difference is really based upon race, not your ability to work. And if it is a matter of your ability to work is making a difference, then that ability comes because you are very differently trained, because you have got very different access to education. Raj Chetty, in this very famous work, the more recent works, 2020, he's coming and saying that it is much harder for Black children in low-income United States household to reach higher income brackets than for white children, and that environmental conditions such as racial bias account for this finding. This is something that economists now consider to be the golden explanation standard. I offer this to you to show you how the thought pattern of economists have also been changing and evolving over the time as we are understanding what is it that is explaining this persistent gap. The major thing, the long and the short, that economists have figured out existence of this gap, this inequality, this absence of equity is that folks are on the wrong side of the history, the long and the short of it. That's the punchline. That some people are, for some reason, structural condition, historical conditions, conditions of past, are part of the wrong side of the history. So, the question is, why should we be worried about this difference? What implication does it have? So we know that the differences exist. What is it doing to people in general who may not be part of that demographic group? What is it doing? And what is it doing to the entire structure of the economy? This is what we are now concerned about. So this is something that is very, very, very well established. There are two ways to think about it. What is it doing to the individual and what is it doing to the structure? In case of the individuals, we find that folks who are disadvantaged, they have their limited prospects in terms of their power, in terms of their access to resources, in terms of opportunity, just because they belong to a particular demographic group and the effects are cyclical. Now, this should be a matter of major concern to the largest democracy of the world. Why is it that somebody is leaving behind when there is equal representation, when there is strong democracy? Why should there exist those kind of a difference? Also, this gap contributes to intergenerational economic precariousness. So it's just not the person of color is suffering this kind of a condition, but this is going to have implication for her children, her grandchildren, and so forth, because the gap keeps on widening. If you are starting with a small difference, it gets magnified over long term. Finally, the economic conditions in terms of it is that it is evidentially, it can be shown that there is a strong business case for both diversity in workforce and in the corporate ladder. The most diverse companies are now more likely than ever to outperform less diverse in terms of their profitability. This has been well established. And as an economist, I am more concerned about how that constrains the economy. Racial gaps also constrains the US economy as a whole. It is estimated that the dampening effect on consumption and investment will cause a major loss in the growth potential of the economy as well. I shall be focusing on just these two things and present with you some facts and figures. The business thing, this has been proved. This is McKinsey is very well cited, very extensive research, and they're doing it in 2020. Basically, it has seen that greater is the representation, greater is the diversity in workforce, starting from the custodian to the CEO, greater is the likelihood of profitability, innovation, research and development, and increased profitability and sustainability of the company of the long run. And basically, they are just bringing in this evidences to talk about both diversity in terms of ethnicity and race, as well as gender. We didn't get to talk about gender diversity in today's discussion, but this is the main result that we are getting. They have, this is McKinsey once again, in this very same report, they have divided all the companies that they have surveyed in terms of whether or not there is a higher share of diversity within the population. So if you have diversity less than this score, you are considered to be the laggards. Then people who have moderate performance in terms of diversity index, they are over here. And the fast movers, the companies that are moving fast, are the ones that have the highest level of diversity. There is a growing polarization between high and low performers, which is reflected by your increased likelihood of a performance penalty. This performance is in terms of the new products that you bring into the market, the share of the market that you can get, your size, your net worth increasing in value, your equity increasing in value, and so forth. However, for us economics, we are even more concerned about what would happen if we close the racial gap. And we find that because the racial gap is existing, we are losing the potential of growing by 4 to 6%. Why? Look, what does growth mean? It basically means that you're producing more and more goods and services. You're employing more people. If you're employing more people, then these folks are earning more. If they're earning more, they are spending more. If they're spending more, there is a demand for all kinds of goods and stuff that you're producing. If there is a demand, there is a higher level of employment. If there is a high level of employment, there is more income. If there is an income, there is a high level of demand. So it goes on and on and on, upward in a virtuous cycle. If it so happened that a vast majority of the people of the country are in a situation of economic distress, are not earning enough amount of money, and then therefore do not have enough time or ability to spend enough amount of money, it is holding the economy back, even when there is a potential for growth, even there are other ways in which the economy could expand. Now, why is it that many more people are earning less than few people? The explanation that economics give that it is a matter of human capital development coming out of education and race being the most important determinant of your capacity to learn, to gather skills, to participate in an economy, to become employable, and so forth. So we had started with the wrong side of the history, and the question is then how to be on the right side of the history. What needs to be done? Once we get those things, what are the possible resolutions that we can think about? And here I am going to go back to the very idea of inclusion and diversity that we have talked about when we talk about companies. And I'll bring back the discussions on economic structure and lead this back to our question of equity, the two terms with which I had initially started. From a corporation's perspective, Harvard Business Review says that diversity does not work without inclusion. In the context of the workplace, diversity, which is to do with equal representation, cannot work if there is a way to, if there is an absence of a way to attract diverse talents, encourage their participation, make them feel valued, foster innovation and business growth. These things have to be done. Otherwise, we are seeing time and time again that the companies are falling behind, laggards, becoming laggards. Also, this is McKinsey report. The corporation's perspective should be that these are the 5 things that you should do to become from a laggard to a front runner in terms of your prosperity conditions of individual companies and corporations. Drawing from best practices, 5 areas of actions have been identified: representation of diverse talent, strengthening leadership accountability and capabilities for inclusion and diversity, enable equality of opportunity, promote openness, lack of microaggressions, and foster belonging to unequivocal support for multivariate diversity. This is something that have been well established. Also, from an economist perspective, it is the education that we must go back to over and over again. So oftentimes in economics, the conditions of racial differences is manifested in terms of non-access to quality education, which can make all the life difference. So for equity, basically rooting out discrimination by acknowledging that a problem exists. This is something that very many of authors have talked about. Race is not a universal experience. The way you'd experience race is very different from I, as a foreigner, would experience race over here. And even though I may be identified as a person of color in this context, in terms of my economic education and the economic background, I'm not quite in the minority. So my experience of race would be very different from an Indian who is working as a custodian, or from a white American who is also my colleague over here. This richness of analysis is something that we really are what we are thinking about, acknowledging it and making this very apparent, talking about it. These are the things that we are talking about. So the fundamental solution lies in correcting systemic discrimination. And when we are talking about systemic discrimination, economists are, very pragmatic people, and we are very down to earth. We don't have much imagination. So we always think that let's fix what is wrong in terms of what can be done and doable given the resources we have. School system, fix that. Healthcare system, fix that. Those are the kind of questions that we can talk about. And that's what we talk about, that basically when we talk about systemic discrimination, those are the practical things that we are talking about. That can resources be distributed in such a way that it doesn't make a difference between children of different ages in terms of their education, independent of the kind of identity that they have. And it has been found that an entitlement to good education can be one of the many different ways. And this is something that also, I'm also citing a very important researcher in economist, William Darity over here, and other reports that have come out of Pew Research Center, that US educational system is one of the most unequal in the industrialized world. And so this is one thing that we can make, despite stark differences in funding, teacher quality, curriculum, etc., that achievement cannot be a matter of a color line. So this is the argument that I'm presenting for your consideration. Now, this really brings me back at the end of my presentation. So I have basically started by defining certain terms for you. Then I have explained that what implication, how do these particular conditions, these vague abstract terms, difference, diversity, inclusivity, equity, manifest in terms of concrete, measurable indicators in terms of economic graphs, education, income, wealth, occupation, unemployment, COVID outcomes, etc. Then I've tried to explain that how do the economists explain this phenomena, existing gaps, etc. Then I have identified for you that education seems to be the key factor. And if we can make no difference in educational achievements across races, then we are going somewhere. Then I have tried to explain to you that why should we bother about it at the level of individual companies and the growth prospect of the entire economy. And then I had offered submitted for your consideration some of the concrete steps that companies have taken and can be taken at the level of the economy to get rid of it. And so this has been the basic thing that I've presented to you. And with that, I come at the very end of my discussion.
Thank you very much for a very thorough presentation. A tremendous amount to think about. As a formerly trained economist, I share the interest in the statistics and the numbers of it. It takes the emotion out of things and our tendency to want to point fingers and blame or find excuses. So thank you for that. I think this is one of those presentations that we'll have to go back and look again once Mike gets it up and going, just to take it all in.
I have a few questions. I think Kristen and then Jane.
Yeah, mine's really quick. It was fascinating. And can we have your slides?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And Lopa, I'm not sure if you've heard, it's a book I recently picked up again by Richard Reeves, The Hoarding the American Dream or something like that. I don't know if you've heard of him or that. It's right in line with what you've been saying, specific to education.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
And such a big problem.
Yes. Raj Chetty and others, the author that I mentioned at the very last, that is the main thing that they're talking about. Remember when I said that when we talk about equity, we are talking about, do we have all the things to get what we need in life, the opportunities? And by and large, education becomes one of the most important factors. Absolutely. This has been, and without that, it's a difficult task, very difficult task.
I have a quick question, and you mentioned the McKinsey report and talking about the real world effects of workforce diversity on corporate growth and relative success to competitors. The way this can manifest itself in the real world, when Amazon was looking for new major, not corporate headquarters, but major locations, they were looking at Queens, they were looking at Arlington, Virginia, and one of the many criteria they looked at was actually diversity in the local area. That was one of the major criteria up there with education levels, skill levels. So that brings it into a real world concrete example. That it's not just a McKinsey study, it's really what companies do in the real world. So yeah, that's important to have that backed up with McKinsey, because then it becomes less anecdotal. That's true.
Yes.
Another quick question is, are you familiar with Robert Putnam's work in the Kennedy School at Harvard? And he had written Our Kids a few years ago. And I was just wondering what you thought of his research, if you were familiar with it.
Look, the major arguments that they are thinking about, and this is something that I wish to point, but perhaps you have had focused on certain other things. What is the difference between the golden age of growth rate of United States and what is happening right now? What was happening in the 1960s vis-a-vis what is happening now? And the main argument that was given was that at that point in time, especially with GI Bills and soldiers coming back, the very opportunity in the 1940s to have access to education, that had preceded the growth rate that we have seen in the 1960s. 70s, 80s onwards, that has somehow, for some systemic reasons, been receding. And the outcome is what we are observing now. So these are the very practical ways. And this has been proved time and again, historically, clear evidences, clear theory. So, even if, so that's the point. But probably you may have other texts on the book. So please, sorry.
Oh, not necessarily. I think what Putnam was saying is really in line with what you're saying, is that there's a growing stratification and that it does start with kids. And, Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids, it's academic and popular writing at the same time. And it really expounds a lot on what you touched on.
Right. So basically, he's almost using, the chaos theory framework, that a little difference over here can have a very large difference over long term across generation. And what looks as to be a small thing in, say, 1960s, it really brings about so much difference in the 2020s that it has got a real implication for the entire economy, that independent of your demographic background, you are affected because this thing has evolved in such a manner, in a dangerous manner.
Just a beautiful presentation, Lopa. You have just such a great way of teaching so that we can understand the information that you're providing. And my work is in population health. So I'm on the other end of the spectrum of how it impacts health. And so I loved it. And I took lots of notes. So fantastic job.
Probably the thing that I've talked about in terms of education, Christy, I'm quite sure there is a parallel literature in health as well. I'm quite sure that it can be done in a very similar manner. In fact, apart from education, health and education are the two principal criterions that determine your life chances. And this is just not for United States. This is everywhere in the world, health and education, the two things. When we talk about the Human Development Index by UNDP or by the World Bank, it's always health and education, and together with some outcome of that in terms of income. That is always there.
So I was really struck by the fact that 70%, if I understand this correctly, 70% of Black middle class youth will drop out of the middle class. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Wow, yeah. That's stunning.
That's stunning, isn't it? Tell me, when you look at the number, does it not blow your mind? Tell me.
Yes. Anyone else have any final questions or comments? Or
just thank you very much. This was really awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks very much.